Thank you very much, those of you who are here at ACC Senior Services and those at home, to another chapter, I'll say, of Morning Coffee. And today we are going to be talking about Dias de los Muertos, Altares del Mundo, Day of the Dead, and other funerary customs from around the world. I am joined with some very good friends and my brother, who I guess I didn't put into that category, Lawrence Fox, Rick Castro, and my brother Keith Burns. Rick and Larry and I were involved for years in building altars for Altares del Mundo. They're going to share a lot of that information. And Keith is a film historian, and so he's going to talk a lot about the films, or some about the films that have either funerals or Day of the Dead or deal with death and dying and grief. And I'm just going to fill in. He also is a collector of lots of stuff, and he collects very bizarre, macabre items, and he's going to share some of those as well. So just to get started, we also have people in the audience. If you want to add something, if there's a particular custom that your family has or that you're knowledgeable about that you would like to share, feel free to we'll get a microphone to you and do that. If you have a question, we're hoping that one of the four of us can answer. So death rituals are well documented throughout history and around the world, from the New Orleans jazz funerals and South Korean burial beads to sky burials in Mongolia and Tibet, and Balinese cremation ceremonies. These rituals and ceremonies are often associated with religion, and as communities follow through death and dying. So most of them are spiritually death, and these morning rituals and ceremonies are meant to bring people together. And also, we're going to talk about not just the ceremony immediately after death, but those things that we do in the years to come. So when Keith and I were younger, we lived right across the street from the cemetery at New Helvetia. And we were taught to not be afraid, am I right, Keith, of being among dead people? Did you want to, how did you play in those plots?
Well, we used to, the park was right across the street from Solon Field, which is where the Sacramento Solon baseball team used to play, which is now a Target place. And we used to wait for the people to come out of the baseball field and come to the cemetery because it was closest way home. So we used to jump out and scare them, which I love to do. And that sort of stuff like that.
Right. So when we were growing up, before getting to, my father used to love to play music, and one of the ones that he did the most was called Danse Macabre.
Danse Macabre.
By, if you remember I can hum it. And so again,
And harmonicas.
And the harmonicas. But my father loved, again, to tell, one of the things he loved to share were ghost stories that would scare me to death. We're not going to be talking about those much today. We are going to start with Day of the Dead, Dios de los Muertos. And that occurs November 1st and 2nd. Usually November 1st is for the children. November 2nd is when families celebrate the dead as well. I'm going to turn it over to Larry and Rick at this point. As I said, we were involved in something called Altares del Mundo, which I believe the first year we were involved is 2001. But what we know as Day of the Dead celebrations in Sacramento started much earlier in 1975 by members of the Royal Chicano Air Force. And they realized that as a way of celebrating Latino heritage, that it was a celebration that was at that point only among the Hispanic community, and they wanted to bring that kind of to the rest of the country. The one that was closest to us was St. Mary's Church. And that's how I was first aware of it. And I'm believing that it was 2001, after the horrific events of September 2001. That is when a group of people decided in the North Sacramento area to get a warehouse, basically, and start altars. So now I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who's going to actually show you some of the altars that he and Rick have done.
We did altars for Altares del Mundo, which we did for about 10 years. And this was an altar that I did for people of Afghanistan. The picture is of a giant Buddha in Bamiyan Valley, and the plate below the picture was the last king of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, I lived in Iran for 4.5 years and visited Afghanistan very often. And all the things that have gone on and all the people killed were really affected me a lot. I feel very bad about what has happened in Afghanistan. This is an altar I did for my mother's family. This is called the Beatty altar. And my mother's parents had 13 children. And all the inside the car is a doll and a violin. The violin was my grandfather and the doll was my grandmother. And all the chairs that are now empty, there was nothing in the chairs except thoughts. But this is another picture of that altar. You can sort of see there was like the back of the car has some smoke coming up, and anyway, it was a nice altar idea for me. This is an altar of a niece of mine named Debbie, and she had many years of illness, and she was using a wheelchair, and so I made a painting of her, and this is the altar that happened with that. Rick and I did an altar having to do with guns, as you can see, and how a lot of people, as we all know, in America has a thing about guns, and everyone here seems to love guns except me, and so it's just amazing how people still think about guns.
Don't go forward quite yet, Larry. So I want to ask Rick this question, because a lot of the altars, first of all, Altares del Mundo was altars of the world, and so they were artist-led rather than community-led, although there would be many altars and community altars from regular people. So a lot of the themes that you did were political in nature, and that was true of a lot of the artists. Did you want to make any comment on why that was a means of expression for you, Rick?
Well, we always want to bring back the memories of the people who were leaders. So what they did and when they passed on, and how do we honor our soldiers and veterans who died in causes of political wars. So it was always a way of honoring veterans, women who, a color that you commonly see in altars is red, and that's to honor the women who died during childbirth, and also to honor the veterans and soldiers who died during war. So the symbolism is there. As you go to and see more altars, the stories open up about who you honor. And so the red is really important. As you can see in the altar here, there are marigolds, and the marigolds are really popular because orange is a very important color for altars, because that's the way for the spirits to come back, because they can see the orange and they can smell the flowers. So it brings them back into your heart and back into your family as you honor them on Day of the Dead with an altar and with your memories.
And we'll show you that altar in just a little bit.
Okay.
So Larry, back to you.
Okay. Anyway, so the next one is, as I said, I lived in Iran, but I also visited India, and this had to do with the Indian and the history of India, and just how much I loved India. And I visited it 3 or 4 times, and always was fascinated with going there. Plus, I also went on a boat in the famous river where everyone in India goes to be have their ashes spread in the Ganges. Yes. And this is an altar I did about Frida Kahlo, and in the altar there's Diego and Frida, and I did a painting, as you can see, of Frida as Saint Frida. And the altar was a culmination of many years of, I did several shows having to do with Frida Kahlo and Diego.
So the Day of the Dead is a way of honoring our family and those who have passed, and also people who have been important in our life, like Frida Kahlo, the artist. And so altars are set up for all kinds of family members and people who are in your soul.
And this was an altar that I did on Roy Rogers. Roy was someone that I saw on TV all the time I was growing up. He and his wife and their cars and the horse Trigger were all really important for a lot of kids. And this is basically the painting I did was the end of the road, and so there's a lamp because Roy was not Mexican, but he did. There's elements. The lampshade is made out of marigolds, and there's lots of different little things having to do with Roy, like dolls and lunch boxes. And this was the last altar that I'm going to show. This was an altar called Strange Fruit. We did this the year that there was a book out about people in America, black Americans who were hung from trees. So I thought, what would you put on a tree, and what kind of tree would you put it on for this? So I know it's a little sacrilegious for some people, but it was sort of making a point that the strange fruit was hanging in the tree. And while this was up, Billie Holiday's song, Strange Fruit, was being played over and over.
And it's a way of honoring the people who died because of violence in America and the black community. And this was her song, which she did about 1937, and then became real popular again.
That's it.
Good. So is it possible for us to show the altar now that we've created? So we created an altar today, and again, we just used different kinds of things that are important in our lives. This is a mixed cultural altar, so it includes the marigolds that you'll see that are in a vase, and it also includes, thank you for doing it. So the skull, or the skeleton with the hat, is full of tequila. So we will celebrate with that later. We also have some in different kinds of cultures. So there's some that are Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese. And in many of those cultures, when a person passes, you leave clothes for them, money for them, food for them that they can take into the afterlife. And one of the small things, you can barely see it, is a Victorian piece that's in the corner. I don't want to get up to show you. But there was also a tradition for funerary hair, which in Victorian times you would keep the hair of a person in a locket or something that was hanging. There's a woman, Katie Nelson, that does a talk in Sacramento on it. She has over 800 funerary pieces, and we were hoping that she was going to join us today as well. We've got a coconut drink, and there's even, although you can barely see it, we do have a Native American piece that was created by an anthropologist in Nevada who studied the Miwok and the Patwin and created, using their fabrics, their threads, a piece as well. So these are easy. And Keith we'll have you show that one in just a second. I do want to talk about how to put these together. What was your comment on this
Well,
one?
one of the other things that you can see in this altar here is just to the right of the bell, sort of the left of center, is our little cards. Because what was real traditional was to have a small container at the altar so you could write notes to your family and friends and remembrances of them, and you would put them there, and then when you take down the altar, you burn those, because you've worked through and you've thought about, and you've honored your family and those who've passed.
And again, each one of these are symbolic of something. So the marigold is known for their medicinal properties, but it also represents the sun, and they're believed to attract the souls of the dead. It's green, it's laying down, you can't see it. It is pan de muerto, or bread of the dead, and it's a sweet bread that's baked and offered as type of, these are actually called ofrendas, the altars.
Yes.
We have candles, which we didn't light, and the candles symbolize both hope and faith, and they light the way, again, to help souls find their way to the next place. We have incense as well, and it represents praise and prayer. And then, Rick, Popple, I can never picadillos. Do you want to explain those?
Yeah, there
The
are
cutouts?
the skulls, because the skulls were real common. You would have a small skull to recognize the children who'd passed in your family. And then the large skulls are ones that they would make out of sugar. We don't have any sugar ones here, but it was real common to make them out of sugar, because we've all seen the calabrasas, the Day of the Dead, and the sugar ones, because the small ones you could eat, but the large ones you didn't, because that was just to honor the people.
Right, and they were impossible to find this time through, I will
Yes.
tell you. Drinks and food end up being important in all the cultures, and we'll ask you as well which ones they are. It quenches the soul's thirst, but it also represents purity and provides food in the afterlife. And there are oftentimes personal objects, and I've included them. And again, Keith, can you there's a little man right there. Well, I'll get it. Sorry about that. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
All right, so can I show it for just a second? So you can barely see this. This is a little aviator that looks just like my late husband. And I will see if you can get just a close-up of it.
Maryellen, hold your paper behind it.
Oh, sorry.
The other way, yeah.
So anyway, you can barely see it. But the reason I said it represented my husband, and I keep it out all the time. We did something very unusual when he died. So each of us have our own kinds of customs. And that was that he was always embarrassed that his parents did not have a tombstone or a headstone when they were buried, and that he never went to visit them. They were in Dinuba and in Union City. So for our 25th wedding anniversary, I ended up getting headstones for his family. And we visited, and I finally arranged to where every year on the anniversary, twice a year, anniversary of their birth and of their death, that flowers would be at the grave. So because of that, he did not want to be buried. He wanted to be cremated. I can't tell you where he really wanted to be, because that's where most of him is. He is now sprinkled all around the world. But he didn't want to have a funeral and not hear all the wonderful things that people had to say about him. So he had 2 pre-eulogy parties when he found out that he was going into hospice. He lasted 18 months. I want to praise Kaiser Hospice for keeping him that long. And he had students of his. He was a professor of mechanical engineering at Sac State. He had students from all around the world and friends that visited him. He did it, the first one on his birthday, I think in 2013. And then he did another one at his birthday in 2015. And it was wonderful because people talked about him. He was able to be there and to hear it. When he died, and we didn't expect him to die when he did, but he lost his stepbrother, who to him was always his brother, and that kind of took the life out of him. He ended up dying 9 days later, and then my brother-in-law's sister ended up dying 9 days after that. And 9 days after that, our friend Leslie James' mother, our aunt, died. So what he always said was that when he died, in lieu of a funeral, he wanted us to do an altar. And so we did Altares del Mundo at our house, and people were able to literally bring and celebrate their loved ones. And I always thought that it was a wonderful way for him to realize, even though he was Armenian, another culture that really resonated with him. So we're now going to switch. Keith has over to Keith. He has quite a few things he's going to bring. As I said, he is a film historian, so besides his collection, which he's going to do some sharing of, I'm going to ask him to talk about how funerals, Day of the Dead, death, and grieving are in films. But you want to show what you've got first?
Well, first of all, I have a Hawaiian-Japanese album, and there's a nice picture of as soon as he gets close. This is an altar, and it's filled with, this is from 1940, and there's people trying to get on a boat. And there's just all sorts of interesting pictures. I collect albums because most people, you go to garage sales, and the children will sell off the family history. So if you have your own family history, but when you die, the kids don't care, and it's almost universal. So I buy them for almost nothing and put them in, I save them. I have beautiful collections of all sorts of things. I collect, one of the things I collect are people who are hated. I have Chinese and Japanese, in California especially, because we passed the first anti-alien laws.
I want to clarify that he doesn't hate the Chinese and the Americans. He hates the laws that were against them. Just if I can clarify. Go
well,
on.
you clean it up.
Okay.
But California, because of the, after the gold rush, we had all these people here and no work. So, for instance, they used to send the laundry to China by clipper ship. So the round trip took almost a year, but it was cheaper to have it done in China than to have it done in America. And there's all sorts of things. For instance, I brought, one of the things I'm talking about are television and film and some radio, talking about the dead. Well, this is one of the first most important pieces for Star Trek collectors. And if you're a Star Trek person, you go, what's this? Well, very simply, you turn it. This is 1938. There's a whole season of a series of these from 1926. And this says, may you live long and prosper, which is Mr. Spock's one of his favorite sayings. And also Mr. Spock had a nice little symbolic way of greeting this way.
I can't do it, can anybody? We have
Well.
people in the audience that do better than
Well, anyway,
us. Okay,
there's a woman on Star Trek who couldn't do this.
okay.
And it's the fingers separated like this. And that was, if you look at Jewish cemetery plots in Europe that are still there, and from the 1880s and 90s, this was a way of sending them along. You had the fingers joined. And there was all sorts of things. In the films, most of the movies were basically either Jewish or Christian death symbols. For instance, I did a book some years ago called Graven Images. It's based on a collection owned by, there we go, owned by Ron Borst, who still has it. And there's all sorts of things in here that are classical death things. For instance, the Wolfman, anything you can think of was used in Day of the Dead. In fact, I have a shirt called Day of the Dead. Well, that's just the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is 1915, which has one of the great symbols of the dead. He comes out of a coffin, go gets a girl, and that's a whole genre, a subgenre. But the Day of the Dead, let me clear this up. Asian communities are almost never seen in film. There's only a couple people who ever worked in film. Cecil Hayakawa played an Indian chief in 1915, but most Indians, the chiefs were always white actors, as in Charlie Chan, and Sidney Toler played Charlie Chan. Key Luke and other Chinese actors and some Japanese actors. World War II is famous for hiring every Filipino in Hollywood for a way in which to designate Japanese people. Chinese were used, but not Japanese. And I'll give it back to you for a while.
For a whole mile? Oh my God. All right, so for most of us when it comes to movies, and I'll ask the audience, there are some really significant movies. 4 Weddings and a Funeral is one. 4 Funerals and a Wedding. But who doesn't remember Ghost? Do you remember Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore? And one of my favorite movies was Donna Floor and Her 2 Husbands. So in Latin cultures, there is a belief in a lot of Latin cultures, magical realism. And Donna Floor and Her 2 Husbands, I want to say is Manuel Puig. I hope I don't, it might be Jorge Amado. But it is a woman who was in love with her husband, even though he was a horrible philanderer. They ended up making the movie later with Sybil Shepherd as well. And after he dies, she marries a very stable, nice, boring person. So she has, he comes back to her, and she literally lives with these 2 men. And so I always loved it because of just looking at the cultures. You can, I guess, have your cake and eat it too. The whole point is those people who've passed never leave you. That's just a manifestation of being able to stay, or you're always searching for them. The Sixth Sense, in which, has anybody not seen The Sixth Sense that we gave a spoiler? You want to? The Sixth Sense was with Bruce Willis and Osman, in which he's a psychiatrist talking to a young boy who can talk to the dead, only to find out that
Bruce Willis is dead.
Is also dead. When we were kids growing up, my favorite movie, so I will ask Keith about this movie, the one before, was Heaven Can Wait. So do you want to talk a little, do you remember Heaven
Well, they
Can
made
Wait, the
two
original?
versions. One with, it was 1940 with, important people. My
One of
memory
my
just
favorite
went
people.
south of the freeway. But it was with, oh God.
It's all right. What was the second one? The second one
The
was?
second one, well, oh God. I have Alzheimer's. No, I don't. But I do have a stroke, which has taken away all the titles of the films I know. I can tell you who was in it, what it's about. What's the title? Oh, I don't know. But that's a common thing now. Also, my age being a good excuse. But there were two versions of Heaven Can Wait. And in both versions, in the first version, he's killed, or rather, Edward Horton pulls him out of an airplane before it crashes. In the second, it's basically the same thing.
He's in it. It's a football player, I believe.
Yes.
Who's in an automobile accident, but it wasn't his time yet, basically.
But also in Hollywood, the first versions are basically the
And
best.
it's with Warren Beatty.
Warren Beatty.
Thank you.
In the first version, oh God.
Right.
It was George Montgomery. Thank
Right.
you. And he was, most of these films are very dated. But I love old movies because they worked on the scripts. One of the things I collect are scripts. The alpha and the omega, the first thing created for a film and the last thing's honored. And most of the famous writers wrote good scripts, Ben Hecht being the best. You can, if you're of an old person as I am, you mentioned your top 10 films, 3 of them are Ben Hecht's. So if you see a film title and the writer is Ben Hecht, watch it.
Good. I'm going to ask about one more movie, Topper. Do you guys remember Topper? So Topper was
Cary Grant,
Grant.
Constance Bennett, and oh God, who played Topper?
We have an excuse. Anyway, what I loved about the Topper films, they obviously come back as ghosts and don't want to realize that they are dead. They don't want to accept that they're dead. So this is a question I'm going to throw out to everyone. What is there about death you think that we create art and movies and other things that represent it as a way of dealing with our grief? Why do we use that as an outlet to deal with our grief?
Because it's simple to do. Everybody knows what death is. And in Hollywood, it's mostly white people. And it's a shame, but that's what happens. So you get Dr. Caligari, who's dead in a box, in a coffin, in 1915. But during the day, in 1940, Warner Brothers and the other studios started producing films of Dracula and Nosferatu and the Wolfman and all those things. And surprise, they made money because people love being scared. That's why today, 4/5 of the films being made are scary films, which I will not see, because you can watch Samurai. I used to go to the Samurai Film Festival every week at the Toho La Brea in Hollywood, where I worked. And every week they would bring some of the best directed films from Japan and China. And you want to know what film is made of? Or rather, how good film can be made? Watch Japanese and Chinese samurai movies. Because they have a philosophy where no shot is repeated. In America, they have what they call, I'm sorry to bore you, they have things called champ contre champ, which is when you're talking, the camera's on you. When I'm talking, the camera's on me. You almost never get 2 people in a shot. Why is that? Because you want the reaction of one person talking to another, which is almost impossible in an American film now. In the old days, they used to do it. But now they have a thing, and you can watch television. Young people get bored very quickly. So the camera keeps a shot no more than 3 seconds. Sometimes you have 5 shots registering grief. Well, in the old days, 1940 and earlier, you had a shot done with 2 people. And this person talks, then that person talks. And you see the reaction of both people. Now you just see one person talking, then another person talking, and you don't see the reaction, which to me is a loss to the film community, but it's a profit for the filmmakers because kids don't watch and don't want to watch long, drawn-out scenes.
Well, I am going to ask the audience, for those of you, are there films, because Keith is basically saying most of the films that are represented don't show people of color, but are there films that you can think of that show some of these customs? Because certainly I can think of a lot of black films that include New Orleans burial scenes. Are there some in the Asian communities that you can think of, or Asian movies that you can think of that deal with grief? And if not, we'll move on. Okay, so now we're going to come back to different funerary customs in different countries. And one of the things that, and again, I'm going to make this personal. My late husband was married to a woman by the name of Jane Winsberg Hazeltine. She got married at least 5 times. But she became a Buddhist and was very active in the Buddhist church on Riverside Boulevard. She was very short. She was an anthropology professor at American River College. She became a specialist specifically in Japanese and then some Chinese culture. She learned the tea ceremony. When she knew that she was terminal, she did some planning for her funeral, and she wanted it to recognize both her Jewish roots and her Japanese commitment to Buddhism. And there was very much alike, and so she gave me directions. I know it sounds strange, ex-wife, but I ended up being the executor of her estate. She wanted to have her ceremony at the Buddhist church on Riverside. She wanted to, in the Jewish religion, 24 hours before you are in the Reform, you can be cremated. It's normally not in the others, but 24 hours, pine box, cremated quickly. And then there are all kinds of rituals. So it's sitting Shiva, which is usually, depending upon whether you're Orthodox or Reform, can be as much as 7 days, where you are secluded. You must stay in your home. You cover all of the mirrors in the house with black cloth, and people come to your home to honor the person who's before. Now in Reform, a lot of it is only 3 days. She wanted us to celebrate her life as well by establishing a yard site. And a yard site was creating, and she paid for it. She left me with most of the bills, but she did pay for this. A yard site, so that at the anniversary of her death, there would be a candle that would be lit at B'nai Israel, where it was similar to the Buddhist, but otherwise she wanted a traditional Buddhist ceremony, which she had there. She was cremated, and she's in, I believe, a crypt at the church is where her ashes are. The celebration was what I loved, and Masatano, who is with ACC, his wife Vi Hatano, talked me through the whole process. And I loved that there were traditional foods that were served. It's how I really learned how to cook Japanese food. And I have to say that what I loved, there were no eulogies, if I remember. Can anybody correct me? There were no eulogies at the church that I can remember. So they did do the ceremony, and it was one of the only times that I felt totally at peace with somebody that was dying. I just loved the entire process of it. And she also left money for the Buddhist church for other people's funerals. So she has been paying for people who couldn't afford it. She left a considerable amount of money for them to be able to pay it. So that was one. Is there any other funerary system that you can think of, Larry, that you'd want to comment on that we haven't talked about before?
Did you want me to talk about
Muslim?
Muslim? Okay. I lived in Iran for 4.5 years and also lived for a short time in Saudi Arabia and studied the Quran a little bit. But I've known about Muslim rites of passage for death. And when I was in Iran, my mother died and I went back to America. And I came back to Iran and after the funeral. And people asked me, why aren't you wearing black? Because it was considered everyone whose loved ones died would wear black for their clothing for at least a year. The things about what happened with Islam and death is if someone was going to be close to death, there was passages from the Quran that they should read, or someone should read to them before they died. So that was one of the things. So they followed the Quran as much as they could. One thing that people don't realize, especially Christians, is how close to Judaism and Christianity Muslims are, because one of the important people in the Quran is Jesus. People don't realize that they do have the same kinds of roots. But anyway, with Islam, when people are close, when people do die, they want to be buried within 24 hours if possible. So before someone is buried, first they are washed by either their family or people who are hired to wash them. Then they're covered in a shroud. And people are not buried in a box. If you've been watching what's going on in Israel and what is it? Palestine, you've noticed that you see lots of pictures of people wrapped in white shrouds, and that's the traditional way. So, so people would be buried within 24 hours if possible. Also, if they have body parts that are outside of their, unconnected to the body, they should be, all pieces of them should be put together before they're buried. So, and people are not buried necessarily in graves with caskets like we do in America. They would be probably put in a kind of a field, but there would be headstones, so people would be knowing where people were buried, but they would be more of like an open grave that would be, I think, kind of first come, first served, so it'd be not just having plots that you would buy. So anyway, it's like I said, everybody would wear black for at least a year after their loved ones died, and there's also, I think, some ceremonies that people would remember them yearly too.
And a lot of what he was saying for Muslim occurs in other religions as well. So we haven't talked much about Christian funerals, I have to say.
I'd like to mention a couple of things.
Okay.
The headstone is a nice, the idea was to keep the head down. The idea is so they wouldn't come out of the grave. So you have headstones, which keep people down. Then you have other things. For instance, Buddhism comes from India. The Buddha Siddhartha, who worshipped under a Bodhi tree, and his his philosophies were used in China, Japan, the Eastern countries. There's a rumor that still goes on that where did Jesus get all his training? Well, maybe he went to India and learned. No, it's a serious
A serious
situation.
discussion. Okay.
because most of what Jesus said, Buddha said. And you can't prove it, but it's an interesting debate that's been going on for 2,000 years. And that's what happens with that.
So anyway, Irish wakes. I don't know if has anybody here ever been to an Irish wake? What I love about Irish wakes is you just get drunk.
And you
I mean,
remember
that's
the person.
And then you remember the person. So I do want to ask a question about eulogies. And that is that again, that it's a way of dealing with grief. And I'm going to throw this question out. How much of it is honoring the person versus dealing with your own pain, do you think, that we do these ceremonies? Any view? So for a lot of it is, a lot of the different customs is about building community and not necessarily about the others. And that's really true when you start getting into African culture, South American culture. It's ceremonies that you continue on for years. So we keep shrines, and I used to have an altar. You keep them up in your house and remember people on a yearly basis. It's not something that you only do for just a little bit. There are Filipino death traditions, and I have a new daughter-in-law from the Philippines, and what she said was, in parts of the Philippines, they blindfold the dead and place them next to the main entrance of the house. So they don't bury within 24 hours. There are places that do embalm you. There are cultures in, I'm going to say like in Papua New Guinea, where they literally shrivel your head, they keep the body, and they then put you on a pike and they take you everywhere for years and years and years. There are sky burials in Mongolia and Tibet, and they believe that the transmigration of the spirit after death, the highest point that you can be in. We've seen lots of movies with Indian burials where a pier, right, fire, is what's created.
Certain films have become modern, in which they recognize that Indians have a life and a culture. And once in a while, you'll see somebody coming through the sacred grounds, and you'll see elevated burials of Indian chiefs or whomsoever, because in culture, the leader is almost always more important than the servant. In America, you're getting what they used to have in England, which was the king and his royal friends lived in manor houses, massive houses. And there's no mention ever of the people who had to work their entire lives to make the manor house work, including all these films with young women having to worry about being married, having servants. And no one ever mentions the servant. There's always the problem about the young woman. But in cultures, 16, 17-year-old girls were married off to 40 and 50-year-old men. There's pictures in America of Mr. Johnson outside his sod home in Michigan, Minnesota, and his third wife, because the first two wives died of being worked to death. And the idea that you honor women is just new. For instance, they just discovered people 30,000 years ago, footprints in the American desert from 30,000 years ago. And what does that show? The man walks ahead, 3 paces behind is the woman. Now, normally women carry children to be protected, so whatever, okay. But now you walk on the street, you see men, and 3 paces behind is the wife. It hasn't changed in 30,000 years.
He could have been protecting her. Anyway, we're going to throw it out to you pretty soon. Funerary customs have occurred for forever. We could talk about the pyramids and the Egyptians' mummification. They're now finding mummifications of cats, what people carry with them into the next life so that their life can be comfortable. They show up in every culture. They're different in almost every culture. But the most important part of it is that we create them to give ourselves our own sense of relief from our grief. I'm going to throw it out to the audience. Are there any questions or stories that you have, funerals that you've been to? We're going to get a great, it's Howard, am I right? Howard? And if I'm wrong, please say your name.
Good morning, everyone. The first question I had, I didn't hear a definition of what an altar is.
Okay.
And in my culture, the only place you heard the word altar was in the church. And they said, there's your altar, and you go down, it's in front of the pulpit, and that's where people kneel down and pray. That's the only time I've ever heard the term.
So, Larry, do you want to address that one? What an altar is in many different cultures?
Well, what I think that in Day of the Dead, the altar is the place where the family puts all the things to remember the dead loved one by, and also things to give them to help them go on to the next world. So that in a lot of the Day of the Dead altars, there would be different foods, things to drink, things to smoke, flowers, everything to sort of remind them of this world and things to take with them in the next world.
Right, but I'm going to add a little bit. Altars are different in every culture because am I right? I'm getting ahead. So in a Buddhist culture, especially, you would have an altar all the time. It's just something that you would have in your house. Would you be willing to talk about it since you're shaking your head? No. So, but it's something that you would have all the time to honor people. So it's just a way of recognizing those that came before you. So we use the term altar. That's how it's used. You have a comment.
Inappropriately in the church.
No, it's not inappropriate. Every culture uses it in a different way.
Okay, the other question I had, when I first heard of the Day of the Dead, it was from the Hispanic community, and I was horrified when I heard it. Oh, they're worshiping the people who passed on.
Right.
Now, then I realized sitting here today that I guess African community, the Day of the Dead is Memorial Day. When I was coming up, on Memorial Day, the community went to the graveyard, and because when I came up, they didn't bury African Americans with the other community. They had a separate place where blacks had to be buried. Right. And so the blacks would go there and clean up the community. They would trim around the headstones and all of that. Now, blacks can be buried, I guess, anywhere. It's not restricted. But I didn't realize that was the Day of the Dead, that they would go on Memorial Day and do that, and then that was it.
So can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Because in different cultures, but I'm just going to say in the Jewish culture especially, you honor the person at the anniversary. It's called a yard site. You light a candle. And I still do this for friends. I know it's going to sound strange, even though I was raised totally secularly, non-religiously. But I would always light candles, and I don't know why, 8 candles for 8 days for anyone that I had known who'd passed. One year I had 20 people in 20 weeks, and so it felt like the house was aflame. But what is the tradition in the black culture at the anniversary of someone's death? How are they remembered, or how are they remembered all year long?
I think it's up to the individual. I had some friends, they would go visit their mother's grave or father's grave on a weekly basis. But other than that, Memorial Day
is the main day.
when they would go and they'd put flowers and stuff like that. The general culture is pretty much that's from military or something, but in the black community, it was to honor the dead. And that still goes on, and that's all I can say about that. Myself, a terrible thing to say, but my mother died in 2015, and I haven't been to her gravesite since she passed away, but I think of her every day. For some reason, I don't feel I need to go to the gravesite.
Right.
And the altars of the ofrendas for Day of the Dead have that same kind of memorial that you're talking about. It's to think about people, and it brings the community together to remember that person. And they do exactly the same thing. It gets you out to the gravesite to clean the gravesite and put flowers there and bring people together to remember. So it can also be done in the cemetery, but it also can be done in your heart, in your house, with a small altar of things that reminded you of them, and emotionally, and bringing the community together. And Day of the Dead has now become parades. San Francisco has a parade for Day of the Dead. So
Yeah,
it's bringing people together, and
Right.
just like you're talking about, the remembrance and a memorial.
So one thing I have to tell you, I don't know if anybody's noticed, there are probably a dozen Day of the Dead ceremonies that are occurring right now throughout Sacramento. So St. Mary's Cemetery is one of them, but the California Museum has had a sugar skull thing for kids to do. They're doing exhibits, they're doing community altars. The Sacramento Children's Museum is doing them as well. So, I mean, there's probably, 12 of them almost anywhere. Did you have a question, or did you want to, or Keith?
Keith, do you want to talk first?
Well, without stepping on anyone's religion, in the black church, you have spirituals. Most of the spirituals of the old days, in the 1860s and 50s, were instructions on how to get to the north. Follow the drinking gourd, for instance, was a way to cross Mississippi or the river to get to
Or
the
many
north.
of them.
And other songs had to do with escaping. Also, a lot of religions, were fostered by the people at the top. Why? To keep the bottom people from hoping. Because a lot of religions, they praise the afterlife. In Islam, if you die in battle, you get how many? 72 virgins?
72 virgins.
And it's to keep the people calm. In the white people's religion, it's to keep people calm. In Buddhism and other religions that have to do with spiritual needs, it's everybody is in the same predicament or boat or whatever you want to call it. But in the Christian religion, it's to keep people calm.
And his opinion is his own. I just want to say, it's not a universal, it's not an absolute. That's all I want to say, Keith. We have a
Okay.
question.
May I just make a comment?
Yes.
I'm originally from a small community in North Dakota, and they're all from farmers. And so years prior, the farmers would purchase big plots for their family. There is a big plot, a Kelly plot, where my grandparents and my parents are buried. And certainly a few days before Memorial Day, which I think is the 30th of May, everybody got around and they cleaned up this plot, and they would put flowers and so forth. So Memorial Day was a big deal. And you would go to these little communities in the Midwest, or at least in North Dakota, and it would be really lovely because all these farmers had purchased all this land, and they then would really spiff that place up. So I know what you're talking about when they're saying, you clean up the, that's just North Dakota. Next.
Now,
I just wanted to speak to your question about the altar. Being Christian, I can't really talk about it except that I know that my friends who are Buddhist, at each home has a shrine or an altar.
That's the word.
They have a miniature the Buddha, and then they open it up, and it's in a nice case. And on the day of the person's passing, annually, I know they always, at the funeral too, they stack mochi, white mochi, 3 stacks. I have no idea why it's 3, and I know they put a little bit of a mandarin, I believe, and it has
Right.
to have leaves on it. There are all meanings behind that, and I'm sure somebody else can speak to the meanings behind it, but I do know when you were asking about altars, that they do have an altar at their home, and they do pray to, not necessarily Buddha, but remembering the parents or grandparents or whoever had passed. And talking about eulogies, there was a question about eulogies. I think of eulogies, at least in the Christian Japanese churches, as a time of remembrance and sharing. You're not grieving so much as, remember my mother, remember my father. You don't know what he did, but this is what he did when he was born. He went to this school, and he was, whatever it was, or the military. And so just comments about those two.
Right. Yeah, so what I've noticed now that I'm in my 70s is how things have changed. Because we used to go to funerals, and now we go to celebration of lives. And I think that that's a real change. And the other is that before, whatever religion we had was kind of what we adhered to. And what I love about Day of the Dead is it's become almost a universal celebration, even though it is perceived, I mean, it started in Mexico, there's, no doubt.
The Mayans and that, the Aztecs and the Mayans.
Right, the Aztecs and the Mayans,
3,000
years ago.
Yeah.
It's now become something that draws an entire community together in conversation and unites us.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I like. We want to close up, but I want to tell 2 really quick stories. One is, and I just heard of her just recently, there was a woman who was dying, and she did not want to be buried in the ground. She didn't care. She had a $30,000 casket that would, make sure that her body didn't decompose for whatever. She didn't want creepy crawlers on her. And she wanted to be buried at the old city cemetery. So she put signs up throughout all the cemeteries who would be willing to give up one of their, what are they called, the crypts, the mausoleum things. And supposedly she paid somebody $100,000 to be buried. So that's one story. And then, as I said for my husband, he got cremated. I didn't want to bring it today. Larry made a beautiful urn for my husband that looks like him. So, am I right? I should have taken pictures. And the hat comes off. And in the hat, because he always wore hats, is some of his ashes. Yeah. And he also did a celebratory plate that I could use as well, and another painting. So, even though he's been gone for 8 years, he's out throughout the house. I will admit, our grandparents were spiritualists. Our grandfather was a medium. He talked to the dead. I still talk to my husband probably 3 times a day. But as I said, he wanted to go wherever I was traveling. And my favorite story is we went to New York, I think it was in April, and Rick and Larry or April or May. And you're supposed to carry something with you so that you can carry ashes on a plane. And I forgot to bring it with me, but I did hide some ashes that I had in a little thing with me. And his favorite restaurant in New York was called Il Coyote. So I took his ashes, and I wanted to have a meal there. And they have altered that's a good play on words, where they are. They had a couple places with some wonderful plants outside, and I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bury him here. But there were people sitting, and it was impossible for me to get away with it. So finally, this wonderful couple asked me what I was, doing, because you could tell I was being furtive. And I said I really wanted to keep some of his ashes there. And they recited a poem, what is it? Do not go gently into this good night. And the young man recited the entire poem, and then they buried him almost a foot 18.
Which is a poem to atheists, by the way.
It's a that seems
An atheist
appropriate.
to atheists. I want to get into.
Yeah, sorry about that.
There's a couple movies that use it.
Anyway, the wonderful thing is they ended up burying him about 18 inches in, and I posted it on Facebook. And it's a wonderful story. It's one of the best stories I've ever written. Little did I know that Il Coyote has one of those search things that every time their name is mentioned on anything, they get a little thing that says, oh, alert, you've been talked about. And so I did get a very nice email from them, because my email's out there saying, we are honored to have your husband still eating with us all these years. And that is the end. There's no more questions. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Did you have something you wanted to add, Larry?
I was just thinking if there was a funny little thing that used to be done when people were buried. They would also attach their body to a bell that would be outside of the casket, so that they wanted to make sure that if the bell rang, they could get the person out of their casket quick.
Now it's
And
TV
it's still-
cameras.
Now, and it happens. Good. So one last thing, what's coming up this Monday, the 7th, Sharon Ito and Koichi Mizushima are going to interview about 5 or 6 of us that contributed to the ACC Community Cookbook. And yes, Wanda, we're going to get you the right recipe for the taro, which is missing something in the book. They're going to be interviewing us. The next morning coffee is the first Wednesday of December. I'm not too sure of the date. I think it might be December 6th. And it is going to be a little bit different. It's the story of the Jews' love affair with the Chinese. And it's not just going to be about Chinese food on Christmas Day, but it's going to talk about the relationship that the Chinese and Jewish population have had in Sacramento literally since the beginning, since 1849. So, and one of the things is I will be talking about a Jewish man who, because he was concerned that so many Chinese died during the building of the railroads, and that their bones were not shipped back, or their bones were shipped back, he's actually paying for digs to occur both in the Sierra Nevadas and in China to try to be able to, through DNA testing, identify who some of those people are. So those are some of the stories we're going to be sharing. We hope that you come. And otherwise, I want to thank Sean especially. Thank you again, Sean, who's our technical person, Lawrence Fox, Rick Castro, and my brother, Keith Burns. So thank you.
And also just a reminder, Day of the Dead is tomorrow.
Yes.
And people have, altars or shrines in their house, what we were talking about. Or like Maryellen, just having a device or a plate or something to remember those who were part of our lives.
Right. Oops. Thank you.
Oh. Yes.